So a 2020 Ipsos survey showed that 51% of the public supported the notion of defunding the police. In response to publicly concerning use of force events, the anti-police defund rhetoric has resulted in massive policy and training initiatives in response to these externally driven public pressures. For example, most agencies have incorporated sweeping anti-racist initiatives into policy and training. In Halifax, the Board of Police Commissioners, in response to allegations of procedural unfairness pertaining to use of force events, took significant police reforms, many of which included de-policing initiatives. In 2022, St. Thomas University created a course entitled Funding the Police, and anti-police rallies have taken place from coast to coast across Canada in the last 3 years, and vocal and powerful anti-police voices such as the Jane Finch Action Against Poverty, have even gone so far as to suggest that society could operate without police. Well, today on the Trainer's Bullpen, we're talking about police use of force, duty-related bodily harm, and how context, or the lack of it, shapes public perception, policy, and police well-being. My guests for today's podcast are Dr. Nick Carleton, Professor of Psychology at the University of Regina and principal author of a new national study examining duty-related bodily harm in Canadian policing. The title of that study is A Contextualized Assessment of Duty-Related Bodily Harm Associated with Canadian Police Services, published in FACETS in 2025. Also joining us today is Dr. Craig Bennell, Professor of Department of Psychology at Carleton University and Director of Carleton's Police Research Lab. Gentlemen, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So, Nick, for our listeners, and why don't you just spend a bit of time telling us a little bit more about yourself, your research, and particularly your research interest into mental health, which I found particularly impactful as I read through your paper. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a clin psych prof here at the University of Regina. I've had the privilege of working with police and other first responder agencies, other public safety agencies in a variety of capacities for a couple of decades now. I have friends and family members who either have served or are currently serving right now in uniform. Some of them I think are actually currently in a patrol car right now serving. And so I've had the privilege of working with police in a variety of capacities for a long time. And they're some of the most extraordinary individuals I've ever had the opportunity to interact with. I think they often get short shrift because I think, unfortunately, the better they do their job, the more difficult it becomes for the general public to actually see the job they're doing. And that's a testament to the incredible work they're doing, but it also puts them at risk for not being able to access the kind of supports from the communities that I think they deserve. So most of my work focuses specifically on their mental health and what we can do to provide supports for their mental health. And so that's something I've been interested in ever since 9/11, which was my very first research study, which just happened to be at the beginning of my honors thesis that 9/11 happened, and you're watching police and fire and paramedics running towards buildings collapsing. And because I've got friends and family who serve, that's exactly what they do. When we talk about their mental health, quite often we focus on those individual level variables, and I think for good reason. I think there's lots of ground we can make there, but a lot of the research that we've been doing also suggests that in addition to those individual level variables, what can we do to build up your own coping skills, your own capacity? How can we support and protect the officer? There's a whole host of environmental variables, things related to organizations, other operational variables, governments, the community, the media, that also impact the mental health of our officers. And I can't stop the need for officers to go and deal with the potentially psychologically traumatic events that the rest of us face. When something goes wrong, we need to call for help, and our police officers need to engage with those. But there's a whole entire world worth of other variables that we could be interacting with that we know impact their mental health, and those are variables that we can change. And so that's that's part of what I try and bring to the piece of the puzzle when I get to collaborate with other researchers across the country, including Dr. Bennell, because I like to bring that lens to it, and I think a lot of people are eager to find those solutions.
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, and I'm excited to hear you dive into your paper in a few moments here. But Dr. Bennell, why don't you give us a bit of a background on yourself?
Right. Thanks for having me again, Chris. I always love coming on to Trainer's Bullpen, and I think the content you're putting out is so valuable. So like Nick, I've been involved in policing research now. It's going on 30 years. Sitting in my office in Liverpool as a grad student, and all of us, we had a number of international students there, many from Canada, watching that horrible scene unfold. So I run the Police Research Lab, as you said, Chris, and what we do in the lab, we do applied police research. We collaborate with police services, and our for me, it's very difficult as a researcher to do meaningful applied police research without partnering with police services, police officers, police leaders. So we really try to engage in meaningful ways to develop partnerships with police services to carry out research. Much of my research looks at issues around police use of de-escalation strategies, police use of force. And over time, I've become, and one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the recent paper that Nick wrote, over time it's become clear to me through our research that the public has very little understanding of issues around policing generally, but police use of force specifically. I'm sure we'll get into it throughout the session together here, but very, very little understanding. So we've become increasingly interested in my lab around public education, trying to figure out how can we intervene with the public to ensure that they do have a deeper understanding of policing. I think that's an expectation that we should have, policing a free and democratic society. Part of that is the public understanding what police officers do and why they do it. And right now, I'm fairly convinced that the public doesn't have that understanding. So it's not a surprise when you look at some of the data that we'll speak to today that, some individuals in this country do have negative views of the police. And largely, I would argue, not solely, but largely I would argue that in some cases that's because they're foundational knowledge is incorrect. They're basing their perspectives of policing on ideas, assumptions, beliefs that are not anchored well to what the data actually shows. So I think this is a very important topic right now in Canada. I hope we can explore not only Nick's paper, but maybe what we can do around some of the data that came out of his paper to sort of change the narrative around the negative narrative around policing in this country that some people have.
Yeah, that some people have. I think it's largely a pretty powerful negative narrative that we have in this country around policing, and particularly police use of force and how those events occur, and all of the multifactorial complexities that we expect the human being in that event to respond, make decisions in those very high consequence types of events. And I'm thankful to you, Craig, for alerting me to this paper of Nick's. And so you sent me an email and you said, hey, I think this would be a very worthwhile topic for the Trainer's Bullpen. And I was a third of the way through the paper, and I had already said in my mind, I said, absolutely, we've got to get Dr. Carleton on the bullpen to talk about this. So, Nick, before we get into the paper, though, maybe, specifically, can you tell us, was there a particular incident or was a problem that you were trying to solve? Like, what was it that was driving you to say, okay, no, we need to really evaluate this and put some evidence-based perspective behind it?
Sure. Anecdotally, there have been lots of conversations I've had with police just off the sides of desks or coffees. I've had the privilege of working on a lot of research projects with police officers and their agencies, and so you end up in sort of conversations. And when we're discussing mental health, it's actually not at all uncommon that they would raise comments about, sometimes it's really hard to hear because we rushed in to try and save this group of people and something went wrong and the media portrayed it as ABC. nobody ever goes back to follow up, or yeah, somebody had to use force in this case and it created a problem. Conversations about things that happen down in the United States and how the depictions that are coming from the United States media end up influencing people's perception of Canadian police officers. I've got, like I said, without naming names, I've got friends who I can remember who they would describe some pretty challenging situations with their own family members, wherein they were essentially trying to explain that police weren't doing things to harm other people, that they were being mislabeled, misframed, and that sort of always stuck with me. There were a series of conversations, and ultimately it was the president of the Canadian Police Association, Tom Stamatakis, who was having a conversation with me a little over 2 years, well, maybe it was about 2 years ago now. And the conversation brought up this question again. He was asking whether or not there was something that could be done about this. And I said, well, there absolutely has to be some kind of hard data that can address this question in some capacity. And he directed me to a website that he flagged for me that indicated that they had some data. And there were anecdotal conversations that he pointed me towards. Ultimately, I said, well, you know what? Let me go and take a look at what's available in the literature and what the data sets are. And Dr. Bennell has been leading the conversation in this for ages. And I said, well, let's see what happens when somebody who does something other than that specific area, let's see what we can pull down and together. And I committed to Tom Stamatakis at the time, saying, Tom, I'll dig into this and see if there's something we can find. And so I reached back and took a very different way of looking at the puzzle. And we began trying to chase things down in different ways through what we knew about mental health and healthcare instead. And we found that there were data sets that could be used to answer these questions, which stood in pretty stark contrast to a lot of the comments that have been made that said that it was impossible to analyze or to get any handle on this. Now, I ardently support and believe that Dr. Bennell is absolutely correct that we need better data sets on this, and he can talk to a lot of the recommendations I think we should be following. But just because we need better ones didn't mean that the opposite was true, that there was nothing we could do here. And so as soon as we realized there was something we could do, and we could hopefully publish it in a non-police specific journal where we could demonstrate that there was no perceptions of bias here. Here's the data as it is. That was sort of the launching point. As soon as we got asked the question, we realized we could do it, and we figured, let's put it somewhere where nobody's going to say that it's coming from a pro-police biased perspective. So that was the launch there. I may have missed important background there, though, Dr. Bennell, if you want to fill something in, I may be missing pieces.
No, it sounds great. I was super excited to hear about the project in the early days. It's about these issues with my students all the time in my classes, and I know the degree to which, without the availability of this data, I know the degree to which people fill in the blanks, and oftentimes the answers that they fill in the blanks with are incorrect, and again lead to some of the negative narratives that we see. So I was super excited to hear that Nick and his team are putting this together. I think they're the perfect group to do this. I was extremely impressed with the paper. I think it should be hugely impactful. I'm not sure the degree to which it has been, which I think stands at the core of what we sort of need to get to today, is why, given these incredible results and the rigorous research that led to them, why are people not paying more attention to this paper, and what can we do about it? So I'm interested to get into some of those issues.
Great, thanks. Nick, when you were talking, you mentioned briefly about events south of the border, and the ones, obviously we all have those in our minds, like the George Floyd event, Breonna Taylor, and I mean even as recently as the last couple of weeks, the ICE event, and without putting any judgment on whether those events were appropriate or not, interventions by law enforcement, what is clear is the public perceptions were very reactive, very fast, and very negative to all of them. But I'm wondering, as for us in Canada, do you feel that those events south of the border have been pretty powerful in shaping Canadians' perspective of our own law enforcement as well?
Anecdotally, absolutely. I honestly think Dr. Bennell is probably better off to answer that question with evidence than I am, but I can tell you anecdotally, you bet. People have difficulty, I think, seeing there's wild distinctions in many cases between our police forces and police forces anywhere else in the world, including south of the border. There's important differences in training, in policy, in tactics, in standard operating procedures. There's huge differences, but Canada is so influenced by the media, all of the media from the United States, because it's a massive media engine. And so there's so much of that impacts us. I think it can be difficult at times for any of us not to be influenced by that massive media megaphone that is the social and other media empire sitting just a few kilometers south of us, right? I can't imagine there's a way for us to avoid that impacting us.
Yeah, and certainly the research bears that out, in our own surveys of public understanding of use of force. I mean, we ask people, where are you getting this information from? And of course, the media is a primary source of that. And, back in the day when we were kids, maybe there was some sort of borders and boundaries around the media, that U.S. media isn't coming up to Canada as much as it is now. But nowadays, most people, certainly younger people, our age and down, I get most of my news coverage on social media as much as I do on TV. And of course, there's no boundaries at all. So I think when you combine the fact that we're inundated with U.S. media, largely portraying negative aspects of policing, or potentially negative aspects, or at least aspects of policing that could be perceived negatively. We're not seeing the local bike rodeo that the police are putting on to help kids fix their bikes, right? We're seeing, if it bleeds, it leads sorts of stories. I think when you combine that with the lack of knowledge that's required to think critically about what you're seeing and to question it, I think it's a combination of those two things: the massive exposure to the media combined with the lack of knowledge that allows you to think about it critically and think about, does that apply to Canada? Do we have the same sort of culture and tactics and so on? It's a sort of recipe for I think, Canadians very much relying on U.S. coverage of policing to inform their views of Canada. And I think, when I talk to police officers, unanimously, they experience that on the street. They hear comments that sort of suggest to them that the people they're interacting with are sort of perceiving them as you would officers down in the States involved in some of these, potentially questionable, or at least concerning on the surface sorts of situations.
And one of the things that I see frequently is these video events. So they're captured in brief snippets of video, completely taken out of the context, and then uploaded to social media or broadcast by mainstream media. And, I sometimes say that a lie can travel all the way around the world before truth has had a chance to put its shoes on. And by then, the public perception and the public judgment of what's occurred has already come to a conclusion. And that must be an extremely difficult egg to unscramble. Like, once that's happened, how do you even begin to walk that backward and begin to reshape people's perspective of the event? So I think I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Nick, you do talk in your paper about how decontextualized narratives are damaging to police officers, to public safety, and to their families. Can you just give us some perspective on what you feel that damage is? Like, what is the negative implications of these decontextualized narratives?
Well, for our police officers, they typically can't defend themselves. Your description was perfect, because they typically can't defend themselves. So a media piece gets taken and shared instantaneously. Well, the same high rigorous standards that we apply to our police officers and they apply to themselves necessarily mean that they can't instantaneously respond to questions like that, because they need to go through the process of due diligence and investigation that goes along with all of these kinds of events. And so they can't give you an instant response. And by the time they do give a response, the media cycle is often long since gone and no one cares. So the police officer might be entirely exonerated, and a bunch of independent review groups might have said, yes, everything was done according to appropriate operating procedures and everything, all the laws were followed. But as Dr. Bennell mentioned, if it bleeds, it leads. Well, that's a boring case. So you're telling me everything happened the way that it was supposed to happen? No one cares. What ends up happening then is, or at least what they're at risk for experiencing then, is something called a moral injury. So all of a sudden you've got an officer who did what they were supposed to do. And I'm not saying that they never make mistakes, and we'll get into that with the study, but you've got an officer who did what they were supposed to do, who was tried and convicted in the courts of public opinion, who in many cases ends up being lambasted by people that they're there to protect and serve. And now all of a sudden they're being tasked with going back out. They have no opportunity to defend themselves. They've simply been cast and convicted, so to speak, without any opportunity for discourse. That can create a huge moral injury for them. The data that we've got out of one of the largest studies the world's ever done, which is on police, which is the RCMP study, we've been able to demonstrate the people who are choosing to serve in these capacities appear to be some of the most conscientious, altruistic, community-minded, kind, gentle people that we have in Canada. They're serving because they want to help their communities. They're not serving because they want to hurt people. They're serving because they want to help people. So it creates a conflict for them where they're going, so I did all of this. I put myself at risk. I put my family at risk. I'm serving incredible hours with shift work, doing all of these things when we're in a labor market and I could go and find another job. And I went out and put myself in harm's way and something went wrong, because I don't think there's any officer who believes that if someone that they're interacting with is injured or killed, that they think it's a good day. I think that they think it's a tragedy no matter what. And then they're judged like that. That's an incredible additional burden we're putting on them. And so I think it's a huge additional mental health risk. And right now we need more recruitment and retention of police officers. So compounding that on top of all of the other risks we're asking them to take, it's a very tall order. And I think it's a very difficult thing for the rest of us to justify more.
Well, great. Craig, anything you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, just the context piece I think is so important. And, you know, obviously we've been vocal advocates for better national use of force databases in Canada. I think that will serve everyone well, including police services. In the absence of that, obviously several databases have been developed, both by CBC and by academic teams and so on. So I obviously I applaud that effort. I think that's valuable, and I don't think it should have been the responsibility of these groups to do that. I think government or policing should lead the charge. But the data that is available through those various databases, the CBC database and the Tracking and Justice database being the two obvious ones, provides very little context behind these cases. So what you end up getting from an analysis of the available national data are very surface level assessments of use of force. So for example, you will have no context about whether the force was ultimately justified. You will have no context as to what the officer was facing when they were required to use force. You know, did subjects have weapons? Were there other threats available? None of that information is available in currently available databases. So, all you're left with ultimately is sort of frequencies of force and surface level analyses looking at how force relates, for example, to subject race. And I think it's very easy for stories to come from that sort of data without understanding exactly what happened, especially whether the officer was justified. So it leaves the impression that sort of police officers are running amok, that they're disproportionately negatively impacting almost on purpose the subjects in these databases without understanding if that's actually true or not. So I'm always left with the impression from analyses of those databases, like, what are we to do with that? And what is the purpose of that database? If it is not to provide context that would allow us to more fully understand these cases and intervene potentially in a way to minimize force as much as we possibly can through training and policy changes and equipment and so on. Like, what is the purpose? So, yeah, it creates a very challenging situation, both for police officers that are presented in a particular light, totally out of context, and ultimately as researchers, as police services, like, what can we do to solve these situations? It's very difficult to figure that out, void of any context around these cases that are ultimately reported. So, yeah.
So in this, the title of this paper, Nick, so Contextualized Assessment of Duty-Related Bodily Harm Associated with Canadian Police Officers. Can you tell us so duty-related bodily harm, maybe wrap a definition around that so going forward we understand what we're talking about there?
Sure. So when we're talking about duty-related bodily harm in this case, what we're meaning very specifically is that there was some kind of injury caused. There was some kind of harm caused as a function of an officer engaged in their duty to a member of the general public. That's what duty-related bodily harm means. So it's not any other harm that might have been associated. It's not the officer acting off duty. It's nothing like this. They were on duty, and a member of the population ended up experiencing some kind of physical harm.
As a result of direct police action?
As a result, the police officer it was the police officer who was the mechanism of causing the bodily harm. That's what we mean in this context when we say duty-related bodily harm. So the officer, it's not incidental. It wasn't that the officer failed to stop somebody from causing somebody else harm. It was that the officer was the mechanism of harm in this case. For this study, that's what we mean by duty-related bodily harm. And just as a quick note, while we're delving into this here for just a second, I think it also is important to flag that we also created a different kind of very long, painful acronym, and it's force that is exceeding legally approved standard operating procedures or involving a code of conduct violation, which is just about as academically pedantic as you can get, right? Like, it's just about as awful. So FACETS, because this is what happens when you let me name something instead of somebody with a better marketing background. So the reason you need these two acronyms, though, is because we needed to be able to talk about these things quickly. And when we're talking about duty-related bodily harm, then we need to distinguish between when there was bodily harm that was caused, that was basically bodily harm that was associated with use of force in a legally approved fashion involving standard operating procedures, from use of force that wasn't. Because I think this is something the public also needs to be regularly reminded about. Police officers are authorized to use force within some very specific, very explicitly detailed fashions. And we depend on them to do so. So the idea that the police officer should never use force, I believe, is preposterous. I believe there are many cases when, in fact, I am depending on an officer to show up and use force to protect the rest of us. And those officers are extraordinarily well trained to be very careful about the engagement of that use of force. So there can be duty-related bodily harm. That happens when you're engaged with members of the public who may be acting in ways that the police officers need to use some kind of force in order to intervene legally to protect and serve the community at large. Sometimes to protect and serve the person who is going to experience the use of force, because sometimes they need to protect that person against themselves. So we have duty-related bodily harm, and then we have FACETS. God help me. Anyway, I'm sorry, Dr. Bennell. That's probably ultimately going to be like a pain, and every academic probably loathes me, and I don't imagine the police are particularly thrilled with it either. But anyway, so
we have enough of our own acronyms.
That's true.
They all sound better than FACETS. I mean,
they'll love this. They'll love this.
So we've got those two acronyms, and so that's what duty-related bodily harm and FACETS talk about, and it's so that we can have a broader conversation about how often are they using force in ways that exceed the legally approved standard operating procedures, or in ways that involve some kind of a code of conduct violation. That way we can have a real conversation about when police are ultimately making a mistake, like how often are they actually making mistakes.
Okay, so Nick, can I paraphrase this, and if I misspeak, you will correct me. So if I understand what you're saying, duty-related bodily harm includes all actions by police officers that result in some type of bodily harm to a member of the public. And then within duty-related bodily harm, there are other subcategories, which is force that's used, that's appropriate, that's lawful, that's necessary. And then there's FACETS, force that is exceeding lawful standards for use of force. Do I have that correct?
Yep, perfect.
Okay,
absolutely.
All right, great. So we're looking then at the contextualized assessment of duty-related bodily harm associated with Canadian police. So why don't you tell us about how did you get this? This was a heavy lift by the looks of it to do this paper, this study. Why don't you walk us through, like, how did you provide context and put some narrative to this?
Sure. Well, first of all, it was one of my colleagues, students, Taylor Tektunjani, who's a spectacular statistician. He did a lot of the heavy statistics work here. So we owe him a great debt of gratitude for assembling the data. So in order to do this, we began looking at data sets that we thought would be difficult for people to dismiss. Data sets that were collected independently of all organizations. And I emphatically agree with Dr. Bennell that it should be governments and police agencies. I completely agree with him. So we said, well, what data do we have that we can navigate? And we reached into the data sets that exist with Statistics Canada. And so Statistics Canada includes data, and they track data on the counts of active duty police officers and police occurrences. So times when a police officer actually got called out to provide service to the community, whatever that service might have to be. So there was an active call for service for the police officers. And we were able to extract those. We were also then able to work to extract the number of times when there was duty-related bodily harm using the same kinds of Statistics Canada-related data sets. Then we were able to reach into StatsCan again for census data so that we could get some demographic information. And then we began doing another additional piece of work. We began looking at the independent provincial civilian oversight agencies. So we've got agencies all across Canada now, and they were essentially all across Canada, certainly by 2023, but most of them were all across Canada by 2013, depending on how you want to look at it. And the details are all available in the tables in the paper there. But these IPCOAs, they're the bodies to whom we end up ultimately reporting if something's gone wrong, if there's duty-related bodily harm that might involve FACETS. This is where you end up with those IPCOAs becoming involved. And so they're independent, and their job is to look at the available circumstances, do the investigation, and evaluate what happened. Should we be referring the officer to the Crown for a charge because we think something has happened that shouldn't have happened? So we were able to take all of those data points. Now, those data points are not all linked together, which is, I imagine, what Dr. Bennell would suggest, and I would agree, we ultimately need, so that we can do even more nuanced analyses. But the data sets at this coarser level are sufficient that you can have a broad conversation about what's happening with respect to police and the duty-related bodily harm and FACETS. So Stats Canada data, and then the IPCOA data. So the IPCOAs are independent. They're literally designed to identify when police officers make mistakes. That's their job, to provide civilian oversight and to go, you know what, in this case, this was wrong, so we're going to refer the police officer to the Crown with a charge. So that's where we collected the data sets from in the first place, so that we could then take a look at essentially the really overarching narrative for how police officers are doing. How often are they providing service? How often is there duty-related bodily harm? How often was an officer referred to the Crown for a charge because an independent body in their province believed that something went wrong? And then, can we get some proportions on that so that we can actually have that kind of context, so that we can know how often is it happening relative to the amount of service that our police officers are providing us? So it's a lot of stats that go into that, and there's a variety of, for any of the academics who are interested in this, you can delve into the stats. We've been as transparent as possible, and I encourage you to take a look, because we checked for a lot of possibilities for inherent data or statistical bias that was in the data that we've got, and we didn't find any. So I encourage them to take a look. There was a lot of rigor put into this because You can raise lots of potential arguments against any data set, and so we wanted to make sure that we weren't accidentally missing something important, particularly when we got the results that we did get. We wanted to make absolutely sure that we hadn't missed something really obvious and really important, or even something not obvious that was important, because the results of all of that data and the analyses were quite startling.
Great. So in your paper, one of the things that you write in relation when you look at all the statistical analysis that you did, you said this actually creates a worst case scenario estimate rather than an optimistic one. So can you just explain that?
For sure. So in any case where it was a gray area, if you will, statistically, where we could choose to suggest that an officer did something wrong or didn't, we always put the burden on the police officer. So if it was ever ambiguous, we assumed that the police officer had made a mistake. And the reason that we did this isn't because we were anti-police. It's because we wanted to make sure that we were putting as much error as possible on the police officers. And the police officers, who I know, would all say, yeah, let us take the heavier burden of professionalism. Let us take the heavier burdens there. It also meant, though, that it would be now very difficult for somebody to argue that we were being biased in favor of police, because at every single step of these analyses, we actually, if there was a bias to be put somewhere, we put it against the police officers because of the overriding narrative, because of everything that Dr. Bennell's team has been able to demonstrate, because of these concerns. We figured, well, okay, let's turn into the proverbial skid. Let's put all of the possible bias in one location and see what the results look like. That way it would be really hard for you to come back and argue that we had created a systemic bias in favor of police officers.
Perfect. Craig, you want to jump on that and add anything?
No, only to observe how, I think it's the right approach to take. My only observation is how sad it is that we have to take that stance, right? That, that we're in a situation now where, as researchers, we absolutely know, and I agree with Nick, we absolutely know that the second this comes out, expectation as a researcher is that you're going to be nailed for this, right? You're going to be, all sorts of arguments are going to be lobbied at you and so on. So I agree with the approach, and I don't think you can question the rigor that went into this. I know Nick and his team, and I know that without reading the paper that they would take a rigorous approach, but I think when you read the paper, it's very obvious. And I just find it a very sad sort of reflection on where we're at in terms of policing in this country, that's the sort of approach that we need to take to shield us from what we ultimately know will come from publishing this sort of work. And I think it's a reality now for researchers in this country. I think it's a very wise decision that Nick and his team made to be able to sort of make sure every decision is defensible and that the results can stand. But I do think it's a real sad reflection that this is where we're at. I don't think you would necessarily make the same decision if you were dealing with other groups, for example. You wouldn't feel the need to do that, and I think it really speaks to some of the core issues we've been discussing.
So you compared. So the comparator for your police statistics was hospital harm, avoidable hospital harm. And I'll provide the acronym to save you having to do it. AHH, that's better than FELSOP, but avoidable hospital. Tell us, what were you doing there, Nick? So you had all of the police data, and then you wanted to compare it to what a similar type of frontline occupation, or why did you decide on hospital interventions and hospital harm to compare to police?
First of all, I should flag that my mother was a nurse practitioner. My godmother is an acute NICU care nurse, and I'm stating that because I want to underscore that we chose this because it made statistical sense, not because there was not because we were attempting to flag problems specifically for healthcare that they didn't already know about. The first comparisons, we were doing sort of an internal check, if you will, on, okay, well, just looking within police, proportionally, how often are you making mistakes, things that we could avoid otherwise. In order, though, for us to make any use of that number, in an ideal world, we've got to look at another professional group and find out, well, how often are mistakes happening among that professional group? Because otherwise, If I say that it's one time in X, the general public has no way of knowing, well, it sounds good or bad, but we have no way of knowing. Like, okay, how does that compare to any other group? Well, fortunately, and rightfully so, I think we have a tremendous amount of respect and positive affirmations for our healthcare system and our healthcare workers, and I think that's fantastic. I think they deserve every ounce they get. And for decades now, they've been saying that there's harms that are occurring because they're under-resourced and they need additional resources. And they've been tracking these themselves. So the same kind of tracking that Dr. Bennell's team is arguing our police and our government should be doing for our police officers, healthcare has been doing this for ages. They're one of the only other, if not the only other profession in Canada where we're actually able to create essentially that shorthand number. So how many services were provided and how many times did something go wrong? How many times was someone hurt and they shouldn't have been hurt? Right? It's really the only comparator group we have that collects that kind of data with the same kind of rigor. And so that's why we worked with the acute care in hospitalizations, because the data sets existed. It's a profession, and it would be hard for any of us. It's also a perfectly opposed narrative. Then when we talk about our surgeons and our nurses and our healthcare workers in our hospitals, nobody thinks that if something went wrong in the hospital, it was because the surgeon or the nurse had malice of forethought. Like nobody thought the nurse got up that day and said, I'm going to hurt somebody. It's the exact opposite narrative that we see for our police. So we thought that while this was not a perfect fit, and there's lots of reasons in the paper why people should take it with a water softener bag of salt, not just a grain of salt, the comparison there. It's the best we can do right now, and I think it's a fair comparison under the circumstances.
Now, I guess some of the limitations in that comparison would be sort of the whole context within which those two industries are interacting with members of the public, where law enforcement is in situations that are typically uncontrolled with external dynamic variables, potentials for harm from not just one person, but multiple people in many situations. It's a nonlinear environment, meaning you don't know what this person's going to do, the decisions they're going to make. Whereas in a hospital environment, it's very static, it's controlled. There aren't external threats that doctors are looking over their shoulder to see if someone's going to stab them from behind, or So I do get that they appreciate your bag of salt, just caution around making direct comparators between those two occupations. So what? Give us some understanding now. So you compared, and when you say hospital harm, avoidable hospital harm, so would I be accurate to say we're talking about medical errors? So somebody's made some type of a medical error that's resulted in unintended harm to a patient in the hospital setting?
Yes, that's exactly correct, as defined by the healthcare system themselves. So these are their own. So nothing there should have been a surprise to anybody, because these are their numbers that they report themselves. We simply moved the numbers that they've been publicly reporting and pleading with the public to help them address for decades. We moved them into the paper, and then we created a structure whereby you could quantifiably make them comparable. That's what we did with that data.
Great. So you have your statistical data set for duty-related bodily harm. You've got the statistics for avoidable hospital harm, and you've got your statistical wizards who do their magic and compare all of that together. And so what did you find in comparing police-related bodily harm to the hospital harm?
Well, just before we step into that, I want to just flag that, just so that anybody listening really understands just how dramatic the disparity is here. Dr. Bennell's team was able to identify several years back that if you talk to the university students, they believe, for example, that a police officer is using, and you can correct me if I'm misquoting him here, they believe the police officers engage their firearms in 2% of the encounters. 2% of the encounter. Which is, of course, nowhere near true. It's actually, I think it's less than 0.01%, if memory serves, that Canadian police actually engage their firearms. but the people think it's 2% of the time, one time in 50, the police officers are doing that. So part of the reason that I'm flagging that is because here's what we actually found out. When we began running the numbers on this, the short version is the number of times when you've got a police officer making an error based on how we've defined it in here. So there's duty-related bodily harm involving a FACETS. It's 1.89 times per 100,000 police occurrences. So if you'll forgive me playing fast and loose with the rounding here for a second, that means they're making that kind of error one time in 50,000. That's extraordinary. I think it would be difficult for anybody to argue that that was not absolutely extraordinary. And when we take a look at the number of times when we do have an avoidable hospital harm, unfortunately, if you'll forgive me doing some of the rounding for the listeners, that happens one time in 20. Now, this is not an attack on our healthcare system. They know that they're experiencing challenges because they're under-resourced, and they absolutely need more resources, and they've been pleading with the governments to try and increase their resourcing. But for our police officers, if it's one time in 50,000 in Canada, that has to start changing the narrative. We should be celebrating that. That kind of an error rate is shocking. It's astounding on every front. And it stands in stark contrast to the belief that 2% of the time our police officers are using their weapon, that our police officers are out engaging in illegal activities regularly. Frankly, at one time in 50,000, just about any other discourse when it comes to police officer mistakes like this falls flat. Because at a statistical level, you start to run out of data to have more nuanced discussions because the number of times it's happening is too small.
So, Nick, I have to ask this question. What kind of a response are you getting when you bring this evidence forward? And it's just jaw-dropping to me, quite frankly. But what kind of a response are you getting from the media, from civilian oversight people, from policy makers, from law enforcement?
The only media that have given us any response at all are you, and there are police media. Canadian Police Association has certainly tried, but it's been relatively negligible. If you take it to police officers or police researchers, they go, yeah, Nick, and birds go tweet, but we knew that before. And I'm like, right, guys, but the numbers are shocking. And unfortunately, they said, yeah, we know, but no one will care because they won't listen. And that's where all of a sudden, that's a hard thing to hear. And in fact, it was one of my officer friends who said literally that, yeah, Nick, but we knew this before you ran the numbers. They won't care. I don't know where to go with that. I honestly don't know how to reply because he was right. So I don't know what to do with that information because I'm asking him, I'm hoping he's still going to put his uniform back on and go back out and protect and serve the rest of us. And I'm hoping he's still going to make a mistake one time in 50,000. And he will, because that's what our police officers do. I'm not saying there's no mistakes, and I'm not saying that there's not problems. What I'm saying is the overwhelming evidence at this point sits squarely in one space. We would have to, it becomes statistically unimaginable to suggest that the evidence supports a different kind of discourse. But it does raise concerns for me because my priority area is actually, Dr. Bennell and I's areas work in very complementary fashion, but my focus is on their mental health. And if that's the kind of feedback that they're getting from a mental health perspective, that's deeply concerning for me, because that speaks to a long-standing history of moral injury. That speaks to almost a hopelessness with respect to moral injury. And that's concerning for me for a lot of reasons. I imagine it's concerning for Dr. Bennell for a variety of other reasons, but for me, that's where my focus is, and that worries me.
No, what's sad about it is that obviously it's sad that you get a result like this and crickets, right? obviously that is sad, and that, this should be taken up by the media and trumpeted to the world, right? I mean, this should be big news. We've been wrong. The narrative is wrong, right? So that's sad. But what compounds the issue is that when you do present this data to people, when you do get that chance to be in a context where you can actually deliver this information, which I do to my classes, for example, right? Before this paper, and now with much better data with this paper, I present this to my class, and I always write a number on the board at the very beginning of my police psychology course, and it's the number of incidents by medical practitioners of, caused through error. I always put that number up there, and I get the class to guess what it is, and of course they start guessing that it's the number of people hurt by the police a year and so on, and I say to them, if that was true, would you be worried? And they're like, oh my God, of course we would be worried. And then I put up the number, whatever it is now, 60, right? Which is ultimately the number of, people killed by the police each year. Or I put up the numbers that Nick has produced. And I say, that number 60, would you be worried about that if that was the number of people hurt? And they say, well, no, that's understandable. They do interact with a lot of people. And then I tell them what those numbers actually represent, right? That large number is actually... that's the medical community, and this small number here is the police community. And I will say, and they're a very engaged group, but I will say when you can have those conversations, that the light bulb goes off, and they're like, oh my God. And you can start to have conversations with those students, in my case, that completely changes their way of thinking, and I think stresses the need to think critically about what we're exposed to. We start to be able to have conversations about, how many other times are we sort of relying on problematic views, assumptions, beliefs that make us think negatively about the police. So it's really sad that if we could actually get some uptake of this research, and we could actually have the conversations that we should be having when this sort of data is published, I think we would actually make real progress. And I think police community relations would change, narratives around policing would change. But it's just so difficult when we get crickets when stuff like this is published. It's so difficult to have those conversations. So it's deeply unfortunate. But I will say, when you can have those conversations, I think you can actually create the conditions under which you can have the sorts of discussions that will lead to very different views about policing in this country.
I think we need those conversations. I mean, from here, the ball gets passed over to Craig. It's because the data sets that he's suggesting need to be built. The ongoing monitoring system he's suggesting for these kinds of things, all of that needs to be built and followed up on and expanded on for sure. And we need to expand those conversations, because these data are just the beginning of a conversation. But I think we also want to take it one step further. And when we start talking about deaths, I think it's important to flag that. And there are some deaths that are still under investigation, and we flagged that in the paper there. But in the last 20 years, since 2000, we have had a grand total of only 3 Canadian police who were convicted of duty-related bodily harm involving FACETS that resulted in a deceased member of the public. That's happened 3 times. That's it. These are by groups who are intentionally looking to see if the police made a mistake or that they failed to follow the laws. On the other hand, during that same time period, there were 47 police officers who were intentionally killed by members of the public. So our police officers statistically are 23.5 times more likely to die by intentional harmful acts of the public than they are to be convicted of a fatal duty-related bodily harm involving FACETS against the public. This is a very one-sided. The data is presented. The data is evidencing a very one-sided conversation, and it's the exact opposite conversation that's being presented in the media. And I agree with Dr. Bennell. If you can get somebody to listen long enough to walk them through, the light bulbs can go on, and that can happen. But we live in a society now where everybody wants things in a tweet. They don't want to go through the nuanced statistics that are required to understand it. They want a one and done real fast, let's move on. And not just with police, with everything. We don't want to engage with evidence. That's why people make comments about us living in a post-truth era. Well, some things require more than a tweet to communicate why something is or is not supported by evidence. And that's really unfortunate these days.
Now, one of the questions I have in relation to that, you guys are extremely experienced psychologists and done a ton of research. Like, why is it, do you think, that society is so willing to assume a good intent, say in healthcare workers, when there's an unfortunate outcome and hospital harm occurs, but there's almost a reflex to assume an intent of malice when it occurs in the law enforcement setting? How did we get here? And is it because that, no, I hear what you're saying about, the research is clearly saying this, but there's people that they don't want to listen. Is there such powerful agendas that no matter what the evidence shows, it's just going to be exclude any of the evidence-formed discussion and narrative around this, and make it so difficult to advance public safety and law enforcement policy and training and practices and recruitment, retention, all that stuff that you mentioned? Why is there such an attribution error to attribute malice? Is that feeding what people want to hear?
There's lots of different answers to that. I'll just give some brief ones. I'm hoping Dr. Bennell has smarter answers than I'm about to give you. I'll give him a few seconds to assemble his thoughts. But I think part of it is inertia. I think part of it is decades and decades of social media and media focus. I think part of it comes down to simple human cognition. It's easier to have a heuristic response that assumes the police officer did something wrong and that they did it because of what we call the fundamental attribution error. They did something wrong because of something inherently wrong with them. It's not just for police. That's a very natural human bias. And to have that slow, detailed cognitive discourse to really understand that at this point in Canadian history, in many cases, we are deploying our police officers to deal with poverty at a systems level. That causes us to have really slow, thoughtful conversations, and it opens up all kinds of risky things for us because we're deploying police more often than not ultimately to deal with poverty. Well, that means we need to talk about wild levels of social strata change and infrastructure change. And boy, that's a lot of work. And you know what? My newest episode of whatever is about to come out and be released, and I'd really rather watch that. So it's easier for me to have this kind of snap solution that the problem is the individual police officers, and you guys better fix that selection process and training. That's easier. So that's the path I take. But I'm hoping Dr. Bennell has a smarter answer than me. So
I don't know if I do. I mean, I've thought about this a lot, Chris. I've thought about it a lot because I really believe that, when you look at, I would love to do a historical analysis of this sort of issue, because I really believe that, I'm early 50s, right? When I was growing up, I think we saw police in the same way we see the healthcare profession. I really do. I think, when you used to think of police, right? I mean, many of us still do, but I'm talking obviously in generalities here. You used to see their goal being to help, right? It was a noble profession where police officers were there to help. I remember police officers coming into our school as early as kindergarten and throughout my elementary years, and we saw police in the way that we saw healthcare and the way that we still see healthcare. So something has happened over time where there's been this sort of divergence where now for some reason, we still see healthcare in that way, but for some reason, the police now we see as being less about there to help, and it's more around their intent is coercion and physical control and the use of force. And I don't know what got us there. I mean, I think Nick's right. I think in terms of social media has played a large part of it. I put the blame a lot on media portrayals of policing. Broadly defined, Hollywood's probably had an impact on it as well in terms of the way that we often present policing as being corrupt and so on. I can probably find more movies out there showing police officers as corrupt than I can police officers being good. So whether it's Hollywood, whether it's mainstream media, whether it's social media, at some point historically, this view of police officers as good has sort of gone down, but we've held the same views as we always have with healthcare. So I think in large part it has to do with sort of the intent that we place on these people. You know, doctors are there to do good and to help. Police officers are there to be coercive and to physically control us and to use force. You know, yeah, I think there's sort of moral expectations that come out of that you know, we expect doctors to be sort of care oriented and harm avoiding, and we expect something different nowadays of police officers. So there is a reason why now, when we talk about this fundamental attribution error and the degree to which we attribute these errors to either internal things in a police officer or situational fact, there's a reason why historically it has changed, so that we still, when we see doctors doing this, it's resources and situational factors. But when we see officers doing it, somehow it's because they're criminals, they're dangerous, they're hurtful, and so on and so forth. What happened historically to cause that sort of divergence, I don't know, other than to point towards the role of media and of course social movements as well, you know, that have come out of some of the events where police officers have done some pretty atrocious things. I think social movements have had a big impact as well, sort of driving the narrative in that direction. But I think we need that historical sort of analysis to see where things have changed, because I'm sure when you guys grew up, I mean, police officers were, you know, this narrative did not exist. Not in this country, at least not in the environments where I found myself.
I agree. Yeah, the police officers were the good guys when I was growing up. They always were.
Yeah, we
right?
were always
Cops
told
and robbers. The cops were
yeah.
the good guys, the robbers were the bad guys. Like,
yeah.
Something has changed, and it's been specific to policing, because it hasn't had the same impact on doctors, despite the fact that, again, their error rates are obviously way higher. Something specific has changed in relation to policing, and I think it's the way the media treats them. I think it's some of the social movements that have had some impact in this way.
I also think they're obvious as a target, right? So when you look at things like how we're trying to navigate the growing wealth gap in the country, you've got people who are engaging in protests. You've got homelessness that we need to address. You've got drug addiction and drug crises like the opioid crises that we need to address. At the end of the day, when our social infrastructure and our social structures fail us, the final backstop, the last line of defense, is a police officer. So yeah, the person who's addicted to opioids, who's sleeping on the street, who's having huge difficulties, well, we don't know what else to do. So at the end of the day, the last resort we have is to send a police officer. But a police officer it's correct to say that they alone are not the best resource to send there. It's just that's the only resource we have left. So you're sending that officer to deal with addiction, homelessness, poverty, all at once. But the officer didn't create that. And at the risk of sounding like I'm about to riff off of we didn't start the fire, and maybe I should, the officer didn't do that. We failed collectively as a community countless times before that officer did their best to try and navigate whatever the problem was. And now, while they're trying to navigate that problem as the last ditch effort of our community to deal with that, they're being filmed on the phone and it's being taken out of context. Nobody's going, okay, well, where was the social infrastructure that should have stopped this from getting here 20 years ago? Like, where was the education system? Where was the social support network? Where was the community support network? Where were all of the systems that should have been in place to protect this person from ending up in this situation in the first place, where we needed to deploy a police officer? And why was the police officer deployed alone? And it's not because I think you should deploy me for all the mental health crises. I promise you shouldn't, right? I guess if somebody's having a real crisis and they're running around with a sword in the middle of a park in the middle of the night, sending the clinical psychologist to deal with the situation is not a good idea, because I'm not going to go. But that's a crazy myopic way to look at our environment. You're sending the officer to deal with it like that. We all failed that entire situation for decades before it got there. You're just now looking at the last half second, so to speak. And we're blaming the police officer because they're the visible person. that is dealing with that half second.
And I think that's a key part of it, right? They are the visible part of the system, right? So and that of course allows them to be presented on the media, because they are the public facing aspect of the system. You know, a lot of these medical errors are happening in surgery rooms behind closed doors. There's not people filming these and putting them on YouTube by 6 o'clock, right? So all of the stuff that the police have to deal with is public facing. It's visible. It's able to be recorded. It's able to be put on media without much context. So I think that's part of the difference between these two groups, healthcare and policing, is that it's such visible work. And given the biases that exist in the media, I would argue that visible work often leads to these negative narratives that thankfully for doctors, they're doing it behind closed doors and aren't being filmed doing some of the things that ultimately end up in errors in that setting.
Gentlemen, we've been going for just over an hour now, but I'm interested because one of the challenges that I believe, so in reading your paper, Nick, here's one of the takeaways that really impacted me, and please correct me if I got this wrong, but you talk about the problem of non-contextualized narratives from these events. And so what I see is, as a use of force expert witness, doing that work for a long time now, is with all of these independent oversight bodies throughout Canada, and I'm grateful they're there. I think it's a needed oversight of law enforcement, and law enforcement are glad they're there. But one of the things that now happens that didn't happen before we had these oversight bodies is you'd have an incident that occurred, a critical incident occurs, and the agency would come in front of the media and they would provide context. This is what happened. The call came in like this. Officers responded here. This is what they knew upon arrival. So they would paint a narrative around this. And it seemed to me that when people had the context, it took a lot of the heat out of the conversation. But what happens now is an agency will have a critical incident. The independent oversight group comes on and takes carriage of the investigation, which then puts the agency under an absolute cone of silence. They can't say anything about this. The oversight group doesn't say anything about this. There's no context, no narrative provided to the public. And so now these counter narratives have a full runaway train to go unopposed with their narrative. And I'm like, there's got to be a better way for agency executives, when their officers have one of these events, to quickly get out in front of it and not impair the oversight investigation. Like, there has to be a way to couple those two things together so we can provide context and narrative that the public demands and that they deserve, quite frankly. What's your gentleman's perspective on that?
I agree. I think that's a really good depiction of it. As for the way, I don't know. At the risk of tossing it over the fence, that sounds like a question for Craig's team to answer, not mine. Craig, what options do they have?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously I agree with you, Chris, right? I mean, there have been countless examples where narratives have been set and then the story comes out, 2 years later? We're not talking a few months, sometimes, these investigations, right? Because some of them are lasting for years. You know, obviously we could talk about the mental health impacts of that, which are ridiculous. The length of time that officers and their families are put under this stress is ridiculous. And we would never allow that for civilians, I don't think. What can be done formally to address that? Obviously, I think we need to get the stakeholders around the table to figure that out. I think you're right. I mean, to the degree that some context can be provided without sort of, creating a problem for the ongoing investigation, we need to figure out a sort of middle ground there. I would say generally, though, I have to remain optimistic that there's something that can be done, or else I would just stop doing this sort of research. I think, I think it's a all hands on deck sort of approach, right? I think we need more, I would argue, the amount of Canadian policing research is pitiful when we compare it to other countries. We need more research. We need more research of the type that Nick has done. We need more research around public understanding and public education. So we need the research to be done. We need researchers to get the word out in forms that matter, right? Doing a bunch of peer-reviewed publications aren't going to help the situation. Nobody's reading that stuff, certainly not community members, not politicians, not police leaders, police officers, and so on. So we need the research, but we need researchers to get it out through forums like this, through other webinars, through newsletters, through engaging with the media to get, it's a very imbalanced sort of situation right now where, the sort of defunding folks are very ready to go to the media, but, those of us looking at it from this perspective are a little bit less inclined to do so. I think that needs to change. I think the media has to take a significant responsibility in this. There have been programs out there where members of the media were exposed to use of force situations. There's been some, back in the day, there was a great CBC article written by a reporter who was, I think it was at a depot, probably RCMP, where she was put through the ringer of their use of force training. And she spoke about her experience and how it informed her view of policing and how it changed dramatically her understanding of what police officers have to go through. To the degree that we can scale up that sort of stuff, we need to get the media more on board in terms of providing context. When you look at the headlines that come out of news stories and you compare that to the actual story, the headlines are so inflammatory and bear little resemblance to what actually happened and what the role of the officer was. We need to correct that. So I think it's a combination of researchers doing much more public-facing sort of work to make sure we get the message out, that we try to infuse data into the conversations that we have, like the data that Nick has produced. We need to get the media on board. We need to get the media educated. And I think to the extent that we can work with police services around their, with their media relations officers, with their community police officers, there are a bunch of really public-facing individuals within policing that, when we talk about public education, I think they also play a hugely critical role, especially community police officers, right? Neighborhood police resource teams that are out there, they're interacting with the members of the public. All of those interactions are opportunities, not necessarily to deal with this issue, but to get accurate information about policing out to the public. So I'm optimistic. I think it has to be an all hands on deck approach. The issues you've raised, Chris, I think are a critical part of that. How do we work the system to not, taint investigations while still at least allowing some context to be presented? I think that's part of it, but I think it's broader than that. And this multi-prong approach, I am convinced we can have some sort of impact. We're never going to sway the naysayers, right? I mean, nothing you can say with data is going to sway them. But for the masses of the public who are sort of ambiguous about policing or slightly swayed to the negative because of media exposure, I think we can influence those individuals and make them have more informed views of policing. Yeah, it's a tough one, though.
It is a tough one, and I'm, for one, grateful that we have passionate gentlemen who are excellent researchers like Nick Carleton and Craig Bennell, who continue, despite a lot of discouragement when you don't get the responses that your research ought to get, to advance public safety in Canada. Thank you for continuing to push the flag down the field. Law enforcement is greatly appreciative of this type of research, and you're bringing the data, the context, and the nuance, Nick, arguably to one of the most emotionally charged conversations in this country today with respect to public safety and policing. So thank you for what you do. Craig, thanks for coming back on the Trainer's Bullpen. I will leave each one of you gentlemen to have the last word, though. So, Nick, let's start with you. Is there anything you would like to say in closing?
Just want to thank everybody who's choosing to serve, every one of our police officers from coast to coast to coast. You make tremendous differences all the time. You don't get thanked nearly enough for those, and a lot of it is invisible. So I'm grateful. Our police officers literally make every other aspect of our civilization possible. If Craig and I go home for the next 2 weeks, if all the professors in the country go home for the next 2 weeks and don't go to work, literally nothing changes. On the other hand, if the police officers as a community go home for the next 2 weeks, we all get to live in the purge. So I'm very grateful for the incredible service they provide. And it's just my privilege to be able to do whatever I can to try and support their efforts.
Wonderful, Nick. Thank you.
No,
Craig?
likewise, I couldn't have said it better. Likewise, and very much appreciate all the service and sacrifice, and also appreciate you, Chris, for hosting this. And I know it's having a huge impact, and always enjoy taking part of it. And I just want to say, Nick, for what it's worth, I like your acronyms. I think they're fantastic. And I'll end it there. But no, I really appreciate it, Chris, and hopefully this conversation can do a little bit towards changing the narrative. I know you have a big viewership, so I hope this helps get the message out there.
Absolutely. We all do what we can to make our public safety better and our law enforcement better in this country. Thank you both for being on the Trainer's Bullpen and for giving us the gift of your time today. We look forward to having you back on again in the future.
Thanks very much.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.